No. Oh, all right. Now, a couple... I think I need to pray. No, we're okay. You know, a couple years ago, Snickers launched this brilliant ad campaign, and it was called You're Not You When You're Hungry. And the basic idea of those commercials, you've probably seen them. Well, they're kind of hard to explain. Can we show my favorite version?
Mike, what is your deal, man?
Oh, come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby!
Whoa.
That's not quite right. Eat a Snickers. Better?
Better. Hey! I'm all bad!
That hurt.
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
It was such a successful ad campaign that they've made dozens of those. You've probably seen versions of that, right? Where they put in like random celebrities in place and it's like, you're not you when you're hungry. And what's funny about it is whether they realize it or not, that ad campaign has roots in biblical truth. In fact, there was this moment way, way back in 1 Kings chapter 19 with the prophet Elijah. Now, I love this story because Elijah, he was having a bad day. Right? Elijah's hanging out. Everybody hates him. He's been driven into hiding. He's terrified, depressed, and angry. And so he sits down under a tree and he prays that he would die. He prays to God. And he says, I'm all done. He says, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am all done. I'm all done. And I think we've all had moments like that where we feel like Elijah, we're just exhausted and beat up by the world, right? And I think we've all had, maybe it's our job, our home life, family drama, maybe just the weather. You ever get like that, like January into February with a gloomy, it's overcast and it's just cloudy, and lately it's just been gross without being beautiful, right? Like it's fine in winter, oh, look at the snow, but we just get icky, right? Like it's just been gross out there. And so Elijah, the gloomy weather can have significant effect on people's moods. And Elijah lays down under a bush and he takes a nap. Let me just read it to you. In 1 Kings chapter 19, he says, verse 4, says, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord. He said, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And then he lay down under a bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. And so he ate and drank and then lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And so Elijah comes in terrified, depressed, beat up, and exhausted. And he says, God, take my life. And God turns to him and he says, have a Snickers, right? He says, you're not you when you're hungry. Have a nap, have some bread. There is more to your journey. Now, as many of you know, we are finishing up our series in the book of Acts. We've been reading the book of Acts, and we've been following Paul around on his lovely prison tour, learning how to share our faith with the people around us. And today, Paul is going to have like a Betty White moment, right? He's just getting clobbered out there on the football game. But here's what I want you to catch today. This story, it's from thousands of years ago, right? It was literally happened thousands of years ago. But it is also a story of today. We are Paul. We are Elijah. And the good news that we're getting out of the text today is good news for each and every one of us in our real lives right here now today. Have a nap. Have some bread. There's more to your journey. So let's take a look. Acts chapter 27. It starts out like this. When it was decided that they would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. And they boarded a ship from Adramyttium and about to sail for the ports along the coast of the province of Asia. And we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends that they might provide for his needs. Now, the one thing you need today to understand this chapter, the one thing you need is that there wasn't any commercial travel in the ancient world, right? If you need to go to Rome, which is, they're in Jerusalem, they got to go to Rome, you can't exactly buy a Southwest airline ticket, right? There's no Amtrak that you can hop on and ride. So the only way you could travel in the ancient world was either walk or fund it yourself, right? Can you imagine if the only way you could use a boat was if you bought one? You have to buy the whole boat in order to go anywhere. And so there wasn't ticket sales. There was no first class or economy, any of that. So Paul, he's a prisoner, and they're transferring him to Rome. And they're headed to Rome, but what that meant was that the soldiers had to look for a boat that was kind of sort of headed in the right direction. Basically, it was like prison transfer through hitchhiking. That's how they traveled. They're like, oh, your boat's going that way. We need to go that way. Can we come with you? That was ancient travel. So they get on a boat, and they're headed up the coast, but the weather was really bad for sailing. It was the wrong time of year for traveling. It says in verse 9, it says, we moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and the sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. Now, I don't know what the Day of Atonement has to do with anything, but it's just a calendar marker, right? It's sort of like me saying, hey, we had to drive really slow because the roads were icy because it was almost Christmas. Right, like I'm just giving you a calendar mark. They're like the Day of Atonement. It means it's the wrong season. The time of year when they're traveling is basically hurricane season. And so verse 10 keeps the story going. And it says, Paul says in verse 10, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that they should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So Paul's sitting there and he's like, I've got a really bad feeling about this. This boat ride's going to be a bad idea. But they ignore him. They say, nah, you're outvoted. We don't want to stay here. We want to go there. So they get started and it continues. Then when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. And before long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. And the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So they gave way to it and they were driven along. So you've got this prison transfer via hitchhiking in the middle of a hurricane. Now the fun thing about this hurricane season, it has two features. Number one, it's really, really bad. They can't handle the hurricane. It's awful. And the second piece is that it takes forever. It lasts a really long time. I think in most of our lives, when you're going through something bad, you do okay if it's quick, right? Like you have one day that's really, really terrible and it all just falls apart, but then the next day you can rebuild. But for so many of us, when it stays bad for a really long time, it tests our endurance and it wears us out. I think we saw this with the pandemic, right? It stayed so bad for so long. Do you guys remember 2 weeks to stop the spread? Right? It's just like, nope, we're going to hang in there and it's going to be super hard for a really long time. A couple months ago, I was talking to some friends who are nurses and teachers in the school, and they're part of this congregation. I was talking to them, and I was asking them about, how is it at work and stuff, and they're like, well, COVID's not the main concern anymore. But it's still just as bad. There are still shortages and all the struggles. I mean, they've still been hanging on for such a long time. And it is so hard to live with that level of intensity. And so Paul and the centurion soldiers, they're like, verse 18, it says, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days and the storm continued to rage, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. You guys with me today, right? Like I'm just feeling this. I'm like, oh, that feels very familiar. Right, you're just battered and you feel like you've got no more to give and then you're just battered even more and they've just given up hope. Now, I've never been in a literal hurricane like Paul, But I think in all of our lives, we have seasons where it gets bad and stays bad for a while, and it can be really hard to keep up hope in those moments. I know. So in verse 21, what does Paul do? He gets up in verse 21 and he says, after they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood before them and he said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. Paul gets up, and they're all beat up from this hurricane. He gets up, and the first thing he says is, I told you so. Okay, this is very important, this thing I'm about to teach you. In the Bible, there's a lot of good stuff, but in the Bible, there are good examples, which are the things you're supposed to do. And then there are the bad examples that you should not do, right? The Bible has both. Sometimes people say, well, it's in the Bible, so that means it's okay. Wait, is it the good example or is it the bad example? Because I think I can confidently state to you that this is one of those moments where Paul starts out as a bad example. Right? Please, when you have friends who are in the middle of their own personal hurricane, do not start that conversation with, I told you so. Right? If you, most of us, most of the time in our lives, even if you're right, most of the time, if your first sentence is, I told you so, they can't hear the second sentence. Does that make sense? If the first sentence is, I told you so, they can't hear the second sentence. So this is Paul. So no matter, and that's a bummer because the second sentence is the actually important one. So please, no matter how good it feels to be vindicated on the inside, please don't start your hurricane conversations with, I told you so. All right, but thankfully Paul keeps going and he gets to much better stuff. Verse 22, he says, but now I urge you to keep up your courage because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar and God has graciously given you the lives of all those who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. And so he has this amazing message of comfort and affirmation. And then the story continues on verse 27. On the 14th night, they were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. And at about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. So they took soundings and they found that the water was about 120 feet deep. And a short time later, they took soundings again and they found it was about 90 feet. And fearing that they were going to be dashed against the rock, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Now, I don't know enough about boats. I don't know why they have 4 anchors and they drop them all off the back of the boat, but there it is. And then the crew tries to run away. In verse 30, it says, fearing that they would be dashed, they dropped anchor. And then in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. And then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless those men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So the sailors, you get it, right? The sailors were like, we're going to go drop some anchors over here. And they're secretly letting down the lifeboat. They're going to bail. They're getting out of here. And Paul says, no, we're all in this together. We have to do this together. So they cut the lifeboat. That's their last hope. It's just drifting away now. They cut that lifeboat. And then comes my favorite part of the whole chapter. This is the Snickers moment. It says in verse 32, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. So now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from your head. And after he said this, he took some bread and he gave thanks to God in front of them all. And then he broke it and began to eat. Okay, so I want you to visualize this moment. Okay, what does that look like? Paul is standing on the ship, and he's standing in front of the guy. Maybe they were below deck or something. And he's standing there. He takes the bread, gives thanks to God, breaks the bread, and passes it out. What does that feel like? Communion, right? That's communion. Now, it's not exactly the same, but this has some echoes of the holy sacrament of communion. In the middle of the storm, when just about everybody has given up hope, Paul leans on the presence of God. He does the communion ritual. And in verse 36, it says, verse 36, they were all encouraged, and they ate some food themselves. There were about 276 of us on board. And when they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Now, I want you to see everything that's happening right here, okay? First, they were encouraged, right? Just the simple process of having food, giving thanks to God, and passing it out gave them encouragement. It was comforting to them. It was a reminder that God is with them. I had a meeting this past week, well, not a meeting. I was visiting with someone who was going through some stuff, and they were struggling, and they were hurting, and I sat there with them, and I felt really bad. Have you ever had that moment where a friend is hurting, and you're there with them, but you have no idea what to say? Right? And I was sitting there with them, and I felt like I was a broken record, right? I just kept saying the same stuff that I'm always saying, right? I'm always saying that, God is with you, and that's good news, and that even though it's rough, God is right there with us. And I just felt like I was repeating myself over and over, the same thing that I have preached over and over, that God is with you, and it's good news. But that friend of mine, she told me, she was like, I needed to hear that today. And a little bit, I was like, are you sure? Because I told you this yesterday. I told you it last week. I told you it the week before. Are you sure you need it? And she's like, no, you have no idea. I needed to hear that today. See, here's the thing. Sometimes it can feel like our efforts to encourage other people, to help other people, sometimes it feels silly. Sometimes it feels repetitive, like we're not actually helping. But the truth is that hurricanes make us forgetful. When we're going through some stuff in life, hurricanes make us forgetful. We forget about God. We have to be reminded about God's love over and over because our hearts are forgetful. That's why we do communion so often. In this church, we do communion the first Sunday of every month. We did it a couple weeks ago. We're going to do it again in a couple of weeks, right? It's not like baptism, right? Baptism you do one time, and then you're all done. That's God's action forever. How come we don't do it that way with communion, right? Like, how come you don't take communion one time and then you're all done? Does communion rub off? Is it like it's not as strong as baptism, so we got to give it like a booster shot or something? Why do we keep doing communion over and over? And the answer is because the point of communion is to remember, and we keep forgetting. We keep forgetting that God loves us, so we have to remember the presence of God, to be reminded that he is with us. We need that reminder over and over. I'm going to be preaching the same message of God's love in your life for the rest of my life, for the rest of my ministry, right? And you know what I realized? When we all get to heaven, I am the only one who's going to be out of a job, right? When we get up there, all of you can live fruitful and productive lives in heaven doing what you have done for the glory of God, and that sounds amazing. I'm not going to have anything to do, because one of the greatest differences between heaven and earth is that in that place, you won't need any reminders that God is with you. The first thing the bread does is it encourages us. It encourages us by reminding us that God is with us. The second thing the bread does is feeds them, right? It's not just encouragement for our heart, it's encouragement for our bodies, right? They felt better because they got some food in their system. God's presence represented by the bread is not only that God is with you, but that God sustains you. Have you ever had that where you forget to eat and you just start feeling really crummy, right, by the end of the day? For me, I drink entirely too much coffee. And if you drink coffee without eating food, your tummy revolts. It gets real upset about that, right? And I always feel like crap. I feel crummy. Sorry. I do. I feel really bad when I haven't eaten food, and you start getting that headache, and you're like, oh, am I sick? Am I feverish? And it's like, no, you just need to eat something. I just needed to eat to sustain your body. Some people, they try to separate these two things, the spiritual and the physical, right? As if the solution is one or the other. I've seen people say, like I'm struggling with something, and people will tell them, well, you just need to pray more. You just need to pray for it. And prayer, I agree, prayer is amazing. And definitely be praying, always be praying. Talk to God every day. But there is no reason to limit yourself to prayer. I'm going to just do this and only this. God created you with a physical body. He encourages you. He sustains you. Prayer is absolutely a solution. And it's a really good one. But so is talking to a therapist or medication or going for a jog or taking a break from that rectangle in your pocket. The bread encouraged them, and it sustained them, just like God encourages and sustains you. God is here for you this morning to encourage and sustain you. And so the story finishes up in verse 40. It's a long chapter. There's a lot to it. But verse 40, it says, cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea. And at the same time, they untied the ropes that held the rudders, and they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground, and the bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. And the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and to get to land, and the rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. And in this way, everyone reached land safely. So everybody makes it to the beach. Everybody makes it. The ship is completely destroyed. And it's interesting to note that the sailors have this moment where they're like, we got to kill the prisoners so they don't escape, right? And it's like this reminder. During this journey, Paul and the centurion, they've become buddies, right? And Paul's like feeding them and giving them bread and talking to everybody as if he's a leader. So it's very confusing for a lot of people. And so we sort of forget Paul is still a prisoner, right? He's still wearing the chains, right? His life, this whole moment with the soldiers, it reminds us of Paul's status. He is still wearing chains. And then I got to tell you, the story only gets crazier next week. Next week is the finale to the book of Acts. We're going to read the last chapter and find out what happens. Okay, so there's so much good news in this chapter, but the thing I really want you to hang on to is that God is with you, God sustains you, God will save you. But he doesn't always save the boat. God saves you, not the ship. For those of us here this morning, the meaning goes even deeper. For Paul, this is a literal truth, right? The boat did not survive. But for us, God saves us, but sometimes the ship comes apart. God loves us, and that love will never change. But sometimes we make it through with nothing but the wet clothes on our back. The storms of life take a toll, and on the road of life, sometimes the car breaks down, and you got to get out and walk. There's an old testimony from this guy, Dave Ramsey. Are we familiar with Dave Ramsey-ish? Yeah? It's like a financial guru guy. And so if you're not familiar, he's this big financial guru, budgeting expert. He's got a radio show, a podcast. He even sells curriculum, all that. But the early part of his story is a mess, right? He was a millionaire by the time he was 25. When he got started out of school, he did real estate, and he bought up all this real estate, and he would buy and sell real estate, flip it, and get higher values and all that kind of stuff. And that was his business. And in just a few years, he ended up with $5 million worth of property and $4 million worth of debt. So he was a millionaire, but he was juggling debt a lot. And so he and his wife, they had just had a little baby. And right about that time, he found God. He started going to church, and so he started to learn about what it means to be a Christian and to live the Christian way, and then everything fell apart. He lost everything in just the span of like less than a year. He was playing it fast and loose with debt, and it ended up destroying him. He got sued dozens of times. I was listening to his testimony this past week. He said, I met God on the way up, but I sure got to know him on the way down. They bottomed out. He lost everything. And it was really scary for him and his family when they started repossessing all the stuff in his home. They took his kitchen table, right? They took everything from him. Literally, there was a moment where they had to call the bankruptcy lawyer and say, you need to come a day early. I need to sign the bankruptcy paper on the kitchen table they're about to take so the sheriff won't take the bed from underneath my baby girl. He lost everything. They were going to repossess the crib that his baby was sleeping in. But Dave and his wife, they lost everything. They're in this kitchen that doesn't even have a table, and they're clinging to each other, and they're clinging to God. And from there, they started to rebuild. He went into the scriptures. He found the encouragement he needed. He started to rebuild his life, and slowly they started to get back to normal. And then he was at church one day, and he had a friend from church who said, he came up to him and said, hey, can I take you out to coffee? I'm going through some stuff. I'm going through some financial strain, and it's hurting my marriage, and I know you went through some stuff, and you came through to the other side. Can you help me? And he went out to coffee with his buddy, and he helped him, and his buddy got his finances on track, and that was what started Dave Ramsey's idea of becoming the Dave Ramsey, right? Like the big financial guy. the bankruptcy is such a key part of his story. It's such a pivotal moment in his marriage. And from that moment forward, they started to make all their decisions together, he and his wife. And the way they did it, it was like, okay, look, we come from nothing. We lost everything. And if we could lose everything all over, and that's okay as long as we have each other. Like, we don't want to lose everything, but if we did, we still will have each other. We could go back to nothing, but we always have each other. The ship sometimes comes apart. Sometimes you wash up on the shore with nothing. But the message of the broken bread and the broken boat is that God is with you. God sustains you. God saves you, not the ship. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take that good news and I want to apply it to our lives, okay? When I look at these men who went through a hurricane, they were so stressed out they weren't even eating. And when I remember the good news that God is with us and God sustains us, the answer seems really obvious. When you are facing a trial, when you are facing a hurdle that you need to jump over, when you have a challenge you need to overcome, do all the things. Don't limit yourself to a silver bullet. There's an old quote. People used to think it was Jim Carrey. It wasn't him, but it's still a really good quote. It says, I believe depression is legitimate, but I also believe that if you don't exercise, eat nutritious food, get sunlight, get enough sleep, consume positive material, surround yourself with support, then you're not giving yourself a fighting chance. See, Paul didn't just stop with the presence of God by remembering that the breaking bread makes us think of Jesus. He actually ate the bread. And it sustained him. It gave him that sustaining love for that whole ship. The challenges of the world are so huge. You need to throw everything you've got at it. If you are battling depression or anxiety, I hope you feel seen today. All right, there are so many people struggling with so many different levels of various mental health concerns. And even if it's not something diagnosed, people are just grieving. People are just good old-fashioned stressed out. There's a lot going on in life, and so there are so many tools that you can throw at these obstacles, and what I want you to see is that in Scripture there is encouragement to make good use of all of them, right? Make sure that you're getting enough sleep and eating healthy and exercising as often as you can. Consume positive material. Turn the news off from time to time, right? Surround yourself with support. That's my big thing I want you to pull from today. Do all the things, right? For yourself. Do all the things. And so my final challenge for you today, it's not actually a challenge, I just want you to notice the presence of God and the sustaining love of God, all that stuff that you need to overcome the hurricanes in life, you can find it in the church. That's what this place is meant to be, the place where you can find all those things. This is the place, that's what this place is designed to be. Hebrews chapter 10, we quote it all the time in this church. You can almost have it memorized. It says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we can spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. You, in your personal life, with whatever you're going through, do all the things. Throw everything you've got at the problems of this world and use all the tools that God has given you to handle the hurricane. And then I want you to turn to the person next to you in the church and encourage them. Help them battle these things as well. The connection between two believers is the catalyst for the power of God. Let me say that again. The connection between two believers, where you take your personal faith walk and you go help someone else who's struggling in their faith walk, that connection is the catalyst for the power of God. So find a way in this place. Encourage somebody. Be present with them to sustain them in love. Break the bread and remember God's presence, and then hand that loaf to the people around you. Snickers ran a commercial where Betty White got sacked in a football game. Because you're not you when you're hungry. Elijah cried out to God and said, I'm all done, I want to die. And God said, have a nap, have a snack. There's more to your journey. Paul the prisoner gets shipwrecked by a hurricane, but he found comfort and presence of God in the loaf of bread. I don't know, maybe I'm just hungry. Or maybe there is a God out there who loves you and he is with you in the hurricane. And even if your ship comes apart, God saves you. So let me leave you with this. May you remember that God is with you and God sustains you. May you do all the things. Use every tool that God has given us to overcome your challenges, and may you do that in your life in the midst of your hurricane, and then in this place, turn to your neighbor and help them through their hurricane. Amen. I'm going to ask the worship band to come up for our final song.